Okay, picture this. You're in the Everglades, right? Sun beating down, mosquitoes everywhere, and you're searching for a creature that could swallow a deer whole. We're talking, of course, about the Burmese python.
Uh-huh.
So today, we're diving into the world of citizen science and how it's helping to manage this invasive species in Everglades National Park.
Yeah.
We've got some fascinating research from the southeastern naturalist, plus data straight from the park itself.
Really interesting stuff. We're talking
Yeah.
about everyday people contributing to real science, trying to tackle this huge problem.
Yeah, so the park has this program. It's called the Authorized Agent Program, AAP for short. It lets volunteers actually go out and look for these pythons. I mean, that kind of sounds pretty cool.
It does,
Yeah.
but it's not all like adventure. The article pointed out that in 2014, one volunteer contributed like a massive amount of the data. We're talking hundreds of hours.
Wow, hundreds of hours. What drives someone to do that? Like, what motivates these volunteers?
That's a great question. The research didn't really get into like the motivations, but you can imagine it's a mix of things. Some people probably love the thrill of the hunt. Others maybe want to protect the Everglades,
Right.
and some might just be fascinated by pythons.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got these dedicated volunteers, but how are the pythons actually doing population-wise? Are their numbers going up? Are they going down? What's the deal?
Well, the data actually shows some pretty interesting trends. Remember that cold snap back in 2010?
Yeah.
Lots of pythons died, and we see a dip in the numbers right after that. But then in 2013, 2014, there was this big jump in young pythons being observed.
Huh.
Like in 2012, they didn't measure any pythons under a meter long, but then 13 and 14, those young snakes, they were the majority of the ones found.
Wow. So does that mean they're adapting to the colder temperatures?
It's a good question, and it's definitely something that researchers are trying to figure out. It's possible the pythons that survived the cold snap, maybe they were just better suited to the cold, genetically speaking. And if they're passing those traits down to their babies,
Yeah.
it could make managing them even harder in the long run,
Makes sense. Okay, so even with all these people searching, how easy is it to actually find a python in the Everglades?
honestly. Incredibly tough. There's this study the article mentions where they put pythons in a controlled area and had people try to find them.
Okay.
The searchers only found them like 1% of the time.
1%, that's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Right, and that was a controlled environment. The Everglades are massive, thousands of square miles of swamps and sawgrass.
Yeah, and the article said most captured pythons are found on roads just because that's where we can actually see them. It makes you wonder how many are out there hiding deep in the park.
Exactly.
So if they're that hard to find, is there even any point in trying to control the population?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Researchers and park managers, they're wrestling with that. Resources, detectability, and whether eradication is even possible. But even if we can't get rid of every python, the article argues that we need to be tracking search effort data.
Okay, what is search effort data?
It's basically information about, like, how people are searching,
Mm.
how many hours, where they're looking, how often they actually find a python. By tracking this over time, we can learn some important things. Even if they don't find a ton of snakes, we get a better idea of trends. Are the numbers going up? Are they stable? Are they going down?
So even if we aren't catching a bunch of pythons, the data can tell us if the population is growing or shrinking.
Exactly. It helps us sort of separate actual changes in the population from just changes in how much effort we're putting into finding them.
I see. And the article is saying this is where citizen science really shines, right?
Absolutely. Every hour a volunteer spends searching, every python they do or don't find, it adds another piece to the puzzle. It's this huge amount of data that can help scientists figure out how to manage this incredibly complex problem.
So even if they aren't, out there catching pythons left and right, these volunteers are still playing a really vital role by giving us this data.
Yeah, they're helping to paint a clearer picture of what's happening out there, which is crucial for making smart management decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. So this search effort data, it's super valuable. But are there other ways besides just searching that could help us track these pythons? The article mentioned something about environmental DNA.
Oh, yeah, you're thinking ahead. You're right. It does seem like finding these snakes is like a needle in a haystack situation.
Yeah.
The article did mention environmental DNA, eDNA, as a potential game changer.
Okay, I've heard of DNA testing, but what is environmental DNA?
Well, it's basically genetic material that an organism sheds into the environment. Like think skin cells, scales, waste products, stuff like that.
So are you saying we could track pythons by analyzing water samples from the Everglades? How reliable is this eDNA stuff?
It's still pretty new, but it's already being used to track all sorts of creatures that are hard to find. Fish, amphibians, even snakes. It could really change how we monitor pythons and other species, but it does come with its own challenges.
Like what?
Well, we have to make sure we're taking samples from the right spots, and we need to understand how long the DNA sticks around in the water, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And of course, we need to be able to understand what the results actually mean. It can be complicated.
It sounds like there's a lot to it, but the benefits could be huge, especially since it's so hard to actually find these snakes.
Exactly. And as the technology gets better and cheaper, it could really change how we monitor pythons, not just in the Everglades, but everywhere.
That's amazing. So we've been talking about how to track these pythons, but I'm curious about the bigger picture. What's the impact of this invasion on the Everglades ecosystem as a whole?
Right. It's a perfect example of how one species that doesn't belong can throw everything off balance. The research talks about how pythons have been found eating a whole bunch of different native animals, mammals, birds, even alligators.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about pythons that were found with entire deer inside of them. It's kind of scary to think about what they're doing to the food web.
Yeah, no kidding. It's definitely something to be concerned about. The research mentions studies that have shown big drops in the populations of mammals, like raccoons and opossums, even bobcats, in areas where there are lots of pythons.
Wow.
And it's not just about them eating those animals. They could also be competing with native predators and just disrupting the whole balance of the ecosystem.
Right, so it's not just about getting rid of the pythons themselves, it's about restoring the whole
Yeah.
Everglades. What are some of the things being done to do that?
It's a multi-pronged approach, really. We've talked about citizen science and eDNA as tools for monitoring. There are also programs to actively remove pythons, like trapping and hunting.
I've even heard of them using dogs to sniff out pythons.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting things they're trying. They're always looking for new and better ways to find and remove them. But, like with any big ecological problem, there's no easy fix. It takes a long-term commitment and a mix of different strategies, depending on the place and the species.
It sounds like we're still in the early stages of figuring out how big the python problem is and how to deal with it.
That's true. But even though it's a big challenge, there's hope. The research really emphasizes the importance of monitoring research and being flexible in our approach. We have to keep looking at what's working and be willing to change our methods as we learn more.
And it sounds like citizen science will continue to be a big part of that, giving us data and helping us track how well different approaches are working.
Absolutely. Every time someone spots a python, every water sample they collect, every hour they spend searching, it all adds to our understanding and helps us get closer to finding ways to protect the Everglades.
It's really amazing how all of this is connected. We started with pythons, but this really shows how one species can have a huge impact on a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a great example of what they call a trophic cascade. Pythons are at the top of the food chain here, and they're affecting all the animals they prey on, which then affects other species and so on.
The research said they found pythons eating almost 40 different native species. That's a pretty broad diet.
Yeah, it is. And it just shows how adaptable they are and how big of a threat they are to the Everglades. They're not just going after one or two things, they're impacting everything.
So what can we do about it? We talked about managing the pythons, but what about the whole Everglades? How do we restore the balance?
Well, that's the ultimate goal. And it takes a bunch of different approaches. We talked about monitoring, research, being adaptable. It's all about looking at what's working and changing our strategies as we go.
Sounds like it takes a lot of time and effort.
It does. There's no quick fix for an ecosystem that's been hit by an invasive species. But by using what scientists know, along with the hard work of the people managing the park and the passion of citizen scientists, we can definitely make progress.
We talked about citizen science before, but what can everyday people do to help restore the Everglades?
Oh, there are so many ways to get involved. Volunteering for cleanup events, helping with python removal, even just telling other people how important it is to protect the Everglades. Everything helps.
It's really cool to know that even if we aren't scientists or park rangers, we can still do something to help.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to take care of the environment, and the Everglades are a national treasure. They deserve to be protected.
I've really enjoyed this deep dive. It's been eye-opening to learn about the Burmese python invasion, the challenges of dealing with invasive species, and all the amazing work people are doing to protect the Everglades.
I'm glad you found it informative. It's a complex situation, but it's definitely worth knowing about and getting involved with.
So as we wrap up part one, what's one thing you hope our listeners will take away from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is that even though there are big challenges, there's still hope for the Everglades. Nature is incredibly resilient, and by working together, we can make a real difference. It's important to remember, we're talking about tracking these pythons, but they're not just out there sunning themselves. These snakes are really good at hiding. They blend right in.
Yeah, we talk about how hard it is to even see them in a controlled area, let alone the Everglades. So if we can't rely on visual searches, are there other ways to figure out how many there are and where they are?
That's a good question. The research actually talks about that. They suggest that eDNA might be the answer, like the key to unlocking some of the mysteries about how pythons move and spread in the Everglades.
Okay, so eDNA, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. We're talking about finding tiny bits of python, like skin cells or scales, in the water and using that to track them.
Exactly. It's kind of like this. Every living thing leaves behind little traces of its DNA as it moves around, right? Like it's shedding skin cells, leaving behind scales. So eDNA sampling lets us collect those tiny traces and analyze them to see what species have been in a certain area, even if we never actually see the animal itself.
That's pretty amazing. It's like having a CSI team for the Everglades, but instead of fingerprints, they're looking for python DNA.
That's a great way to put it. It's a new technology, but the research suggests it could be a real game changer for figuring out where the pythons are, how many there are, and how they're moving around in the Everglades.
So eDNA sounds like a really powerful tool, but are there any downsides? There are always limitations with new technology, right?
You're right, it's not perfect. The research does talk about some challenges, like we need to make sure we're collecting samples in the right places to get accurate results.
Makes sense.
And we also need to understand how long the python DNA hangs around in the environment, which can depend on things like the water temperature, how fast the water is moving, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And of course, we need to be able to correctly interpret the results, which can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, sounds like there's a lot to it. But the potential seems huge, especially since it's so hard to find these snakes just by looking for them.
Exactly. And as the technology keeps getting better and more affordable, it could really change how we monitor pythons, not just in the Everglades, but everywhere.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges of tracking these pythons, but I'm curious about the bigger picture, What kind of impact are they having on the whole Everglades ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a key question. The python invasion is a good example of how one species, just one, that doesn't belong, can really mess things up. The research mentions that they've seen pythons eating all kinds of native animals, including mammals, birds, and even alligators.
Oh, I remember reading that they've found pythons with whole deer inside of them. It's kind of scary to think about how that's changing things, the whole food web.
Yeah, it's definitely a big concern. The research cites some studies that show really big drops in the populations of mammals, like raccoons, opossums, even bobcats in areas where pythons are common.
Wow.
And it's not just about them eating those animals. They could also be competing with the predators that are supposed to be there and just throwing off the whole balance of the ecosystem.
So it's not just about getting rid of the pythons, it's about fixing the whole Everglades. What are some of the ways they're trying to do that?
Well, it involves a lot of different things. We've talked about using citizen science and eDNA to keep track of the pythons. But there are also programs where they actively try to remove them, like trapping and hunting.
I've even heard of them using dogs to sniff out pythons. Is that true?
Yeah, that's one of the more creative approaches they're trying. They're always on the lookout for new, more effective ways to find and remove these pythons. But, like with any big environmental problem, there's no quick fix. It takes a long-term commitment, you know? And using different strategies, depending on the specific place and what species you're dealing with.
It seems like we're still early on in figuring out how big this problem is and how to solve it.
That's a fair assessment. But even though it's a big challenge, there's reason to be optimistic. The research talks about how important it is to keep monitoring, keep researching, and be willing to adapt. We can't just keep doing the same thing. We have to keep learning and be ready to change our approach as we go.
And it sounds like citizen science will continue to be a big part of that, right? Providing data and helping us track how well our efforts are working.
Definitely. Every time someone spots a python, collects a water sample, spends time searching, it all helps us understand what's going on and gets us closer to finding ways to protect the Everglades.
It's pretty crazy to think about how all of this is connected. We started talking about pythons, but it really shows how one species can have a ripple effect through a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right. It's a great example of what ecologists call a trophic cascade. Those pythons, they're at the top of the food chain in the Everglades. So them being there is really impacting the populations of all the animals they prey on, and then that affects other species further down the line.
The article even mentioned that pythons have been found to eat almost 40 different kinds of native animals. That's a pretty wide range of prey.
Yeah, it is. It shows how adaptable they are, which makes them even more of a threat to the Everglades ecosystem. They're not picky eaters,
Yeah.
They're impacting the entire food web.
So what can we do about it? I mean, we've talked about trying to control the pythons themselves, but how do we go about restoring the balance of the whole Everglades?
That's the big goal. And it's going to take a lot of different approaches. We've talked about the importance of monitoring the situation, doing research, and being adaptable in our management strategies. It's all about constantly evaluating what's working and what's not, and then, being willing to adjust our strategies as we learn more.
It sounds like a really long-term commitment.
It is. There's no quick fix when you're dealing with an ecosystem that's been thrown off balance by an invasive species. But, by combining our scientific knowledge with the dedication of all the park managers and the passion of citizen scientists, we can make real progress.
We talked about citizen science earlier, but I'm curious to know more about how everyday people can actually get involved with Everglades restoration.
Well, there are all sorts of ways that people can contribute. People could volunteer for cleanup events or participate in python removal programs, or even just educate others about the importance of protecting the Everglades. Every little bit helps.
That's a good point. It's empowering to know that even if we're not scientists or park rangers, we can still do our part to help protect this amazing ecosystem.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to be stewards of the environment. And, the Everglades is a national treasure. It deserves our protection.
I have to say, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's been a real eye-opener to learn about the Burmese python invasion and, the challenges of managing an invasive species and all the work that's being done to protect the Everglades.
I'm glad you found it informative. It's a
Yeah.
complicated issue, but it's one that's definitely worth learning about and getting involved with.
So as we wrap up this episode, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing to remember is that even though we're facing some really big challenges, there's still hope for the Everglades. Nature is incredibly resilient, and when we work together, we can make a real positive impact.
Well said. And on that note of cautious optimism, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Everglades.